The stormy night that changed everything. The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of shimmering reflections. Officer Greg Matthews sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming absently against the dashboard as the radio crackled with static. His shift had been long and uneventful, routine disturbances, a few speeding tickets, and a call about a drunk man trying to break into his own car. Greg exhaled, watching the raindrops race each other down the windshield. It was nights like these that made him feel the weight of his badge. The loneliness of the job pressed down on him, filling the empty spaces in his chest where things like ambition and hope used to live. Then, his radio came to life. Unit 14, we have a welfare check request at Cedar Grove Apartments, Building C, neighbor reports hearing persistent crying from inside the residence. No adult response. Greg stiffened. Cedar Grove. That place was a black hole of misery. Drugs, gang activity, abandoned units occupied by squatters. He had seen things there he wished he could forget. Copy that. En route. His voice was calm, but his pulse had quickened. He turned on the sirens, not because he was rushing, but because Cedar Grove wasn't a place to approach without caution. As he drove through the deserted streets, the rain hammered against his windshield, his wipers barely keeping up. Despite the exhaustion tugging at his limbs, his mind sharpened. He had been an officer long enough to know that calls like these often led to discovering something far worse than just a crying child. As he pulled into the parking lot of Cedar Grove, the place looked even worse than he remembered. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting eerie, shifting shadows over the cracked pavement. Piles of trash and forgotten furniture sat beneath stairwells, evidence of a building where hope had long since packed its bags and left. Greg grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. The downpour instantly soaked through his uniform, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the dark windows of Building C, searching for any signs of movement. A door creaked open from a nearby unit. A middle-aged woman peeked her head out, wrapping a tattered shawl around her shoulders. "You the cop?" she asked in a hushed voice. Greg nodded. "You the one who called it in?" She nodded quickly, eyes darting toward the upper floors. "Third floor, apartment 307. I hear babies crying. All night. But nobody comes. Nobody checks. I knocked, but nothing." Greg's jaw tightened. He could hear the faintest hint of distress in the woman's voice, but he also recognized something else, fear. "Who lives there?" he asked. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "A woman. Young. Maybe early 20s. Ain't seen her in days." Greg turned toward the stairwell. The air smelled like mildew, cigarette smoke, and something far worse beneath it all. He had a bad feeling about this. He climbed the stairs two at a time, his boots leaving wet prints on the concrete. The closer he got to the third floor, the clearer the sound became, soft, pitiful wailing, the unmistakable cries of infants left alone for far too long. He reached apartment 307 and knocked firmly. "Police. If anyone's in there, open up." Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. "This is Officer Matthews. If you don't answer, I'll have to force entry." Still nothing. Greg pulled back, bracing himself. He had done this 100 times before, but it never got easier. He took a deep breath, then drove his shoulder into the door. It didn't give at first, but on the second hit, it burst open with a sharp crack, revealing darkness beyond. The smell hit him first. Stale air, rotting food, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of neglect. He lifted his flashlight and swept it over the room. The apartment was nearly empty, no furniture except for a stained couch, a broken coffee table, and an overturned trash can spilling its contents onto the floor. A thin mattress lay against the far wall, covered in a mess of blankets. Then, he saw them. Two small figures huddled in the corner, wrapped in dirty sheets. Twin babies, no older than a few months, barely strong enough to lift their heads but crying as loud as their tiny lungs could manage. Greg's breath caught in his throat. "Jesus!" he muttered, quickly stepping inside. He knelt beside them, his heart pounding. The babies were cold, their cheeks damp with tears. They were starving, he could see the frailness in their limbs, the way their tiny hands trembled. "Hey, hey," Greg whispered, carefully reaching out. "It's okay. You're safe now." One of the twins let out a weak whimper, his tiny fingers grasping at Greg's sleeve as if sensing he was their only hope. Greg looked around the apartment again, searching for any sign of a parent. Nothing. No bottles. No diapers. No signs of care. His stomach twisted. These babies had been left here. Abandoned. He swallowed hard and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I have 2 abandoned infants in Cedar Grove, apartment 307. Request immediate medical assistance." "Copy, Unit 14. EMTs en route." Greg took off his jacket and wrapped it around the twins, trying to give them what little warmth he could. One of them, Greg couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl, let out a tiny sigh and nestled into the fabric, their crying slowing. "You're gonna be okay," Greg promised. But deep down, he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, them or himself. Because something told him that this was just the beginning. A sacrifice that cost everything. Greg knelt on the cold, damp floor of the abandoned apartment, cradling the fragile infants in his arms. The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest, heavier than his bulletproof vest. The twins, tiny, malnourished, and trembling, clung to the warmth of his jacket as if it were the only safe place left in the world. His radio crackled. "Unit 14, EMTs are en route. ETA 6 minutes. Copy that." His voice was steady, but his hands shook. Not from fear, Greg had seen worse in his years as an officer, but from the sheer injustice of it all. Who could do this? Who could leave 2 helpless children to starve in the dark? His eyes swept the apartment again. The dim glow of his flashlight revealed more of the squalor: empty beer bottles, cigarette butts crushed into the carpet, a single tattered onesie tossed in the corner like an afterthought. A small baby bottle sat on the floor, but the formula inside had curdled into a rancid sludge. Greg swallowed down the rising anger in his throat. Then, something caught his eye. A photograph, lying half-buried beneath a pile of old mail. He reached for it carefully, shaking off the dust and grime. The image was faded, the edges curled from neglect, but the subjects were clear: 2 baby boys, maybe a few weeks younger than the ones in his arms, swaddled in matching blue blankets. And beside them, a young woman. Her eyes were bright, full of life, but something about her expression felt off, like someone smiling for a picture but screaming inside. Greg flipped the photo over. A date was scrawled in shaky handwriting. March 10, 2002. "Isaiah and Elijah, my boys." Greg clenched his jaw. So, they had names. He exhaled sharply and turned his attention back to the door. Where the hell was their mother? Then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Greg tensed, shifting to shield the babies as he reached for his holster. A woman burst through the doorway, wild-eyed and dripping from the rain. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "No, no, please," she sobbed, stumbling forward. "Don't take them." Greg's heart pounded as he studied her. It was her. The woman from the photo. "Ma'am, step back," he said, his voice firm but calm. She ignored him, falling to her knees before him. I was coming back. I swear." Her hands trembled as she reached toward the babies, but Greg instinctively pulled them closer. These children were left alone, starving. His tone hardened. How long were they here? Tears streamed down her face. She choked. I didn't mean to. I had to go. I didn't have a choice. Greg narrowed his eyes. Where did you go? She sobbed harder. I needed money. I was looking for work. But nobody wants to hire a single mother with no experience. I tried everything. Greg stared at her. He had seen desperate people before, people pushed to the edge by a system that didn't care. But he had also seen neglect, seen parents who abandoned their kids without a second thought. Ma'am, do you have any family? Anyone who can help you? She shook her head violently. No one. Greg exhaled. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But these babies had been alone for days. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The EMTs rushed in, assessing the twins with expert hands. Greg gently transferred them to the waiting paramedics, his jacket still wrapped around their tiny bodies. The young mother reached out. Please, where are they taking them? Greg sighed. To the hospital. They need medical attention. No, she sobbed, collapsing to the floor. They'll take them away from me. Greg hesitated. The weight of his badge felt unbearable. He had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing. But what was the right thing here? The law was clear. These children had been abandoned. They needed care, and their mother, no matter her circumstances, had left them to fend for themselves. Still, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. That this woman wasn't just another neglectful parent. But before he could make a decision, his radio crackled again. Unit 14, report to the station. Chief wants to see you. Greg's stomach twisted. This wasn't just another call. This was about to become something much, much bigger. At the station. Greg sat in the chief's office, his uniform still damp from the storm. Across from him, Chief Reynolds, a man who had been with the department for over 30 years, studied him with tired eyes. Matthews, Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. What the hell were you thinking? Greg clenched his jaw. I did my job. Those kids were abandoned. The chief cut him off. And you took the mother's side. Greg shook his head. I didn't take anyone's side. I made sure the kids were safe. That's all. Reynolds leaned forward. You want to explain why you personally paid for their hospital stay? Greg flinched. He had hoped that would go unnoticed. They would have ended up in the system without it, Greg muttered. I wasn't gonna let that happen. Reynolds exhaled sharply. Greg, listen to me. You're a damn good cop. One of the best. But you crossed a line. The department doesn't look kindly on officers making personal investments in cases like this. Greg's hands curled into fists. They're just babies, Chief. Reynolds shook his head. I know. But the rules are the rules. Greg knew where this was going before the words even left the chief's mouth. You're being suspended, Reynolds said, his voice heavy. Indefinitely. Greg felt the ground fall out from under him. Suspended? His voice came out hoarse. For what? Doing the right thing? For getting too involved. The chief's eyes softened. Greg, I know your heart's in the right place. But you went beyond your duty. Greg stood up, jaw tight. Fine. But as he turned to leave, Reynolds spoke again. The twins are going into foster care. Greg froze. His throat tightened. And their mother? He asked without turning around. Reynolds sighed. Charged with child endangerment. She won't be seeing them again. Greg felt something inside him break. He had saved those kids. But at what cost? As he walked out of the station that night, the rain still falling in steady sheets, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Powerless. He had lost his badge. Lost his purpose. And 2 innocent children were about to be swallowed by a system that would forget them. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his story with those twins wasn't over. Not even close. Because 20 years later, when Greg would find himself at his lowest, when he would be convinced that he had been forgotten by the very world he had sworn to protect, they would come back. And they would change everything. Lost years, unseen bonds. The days after his suspension felt like a blur. Greg Matthews, once a respected officer, was now just another man wandering through life without a purpose. He tried to fight it. He told himself he would get back on his feet. But every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who had given everything for the badge, only to have it ripped away the moment he dared to care. It wasn't just the job he lost, it was his identity. He had spent years serving, protecting, and making split-second decisions that could change lives. And now? Now he was nobody. His apartment became a prison. Bills stacked up on the kitchen counter, unopened. Calls from his former colleagues went unanswered. He ignored the emails from the department, the ones offering him the opportunity to appeal his suspension. He knew how this would go. He had gone too far in the eyes of the system, and in their world, there was no redemption for an officer who had dared to put compassion before policy. But the thing that haunted him the most wasn't losing his career. It was the twins. Isaiah and Elijah. Greg had spent nights lying awake, wondering where they were. If they were safe. If they had ended up in a good home, or if they had been bounced from foster house to foster house like so many others. He had checked once, just once, when the pain of not knowing became unbearable. Using some old contacts, he found out that they had indeed been placed in foster care, separated for a short time before finally being reunited with a single mother in a small town a few states away. It was a small relief, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to know more. He wanted to see them, to know if they had turned out okay. But what could he do? Show up as the disgraced ex-cop who once carried them out of a roach-infested apartment? He had nothing to offer them. And so, he let them go. Years passed, but the pain remained. Greg's life spiraled. At first, he tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy. He picked up security jobs, first at a mall, then at a shipping warehouse. The pay was insulting compared to what he once earned, but at least it kept him busy. But no matter where he went, the past followed him. People in law enforcement circles knew his story. Some respected him for what he did, but most saw him as a cautionary tale, the cop who got too involved. And so, he drifted from job to job, city to city, until eventually, he found himself in a dingy one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. He barely spoke to anyone. He had no family left, no close friends. His entire life had been the force, and when he lost that, he lost everything. One night, after another long shift guarding an empty parking lot, Greg found himself at a rundown diner, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at the rain as it hit the window. It had been almost 20 years. 20 years since that night. 20 years since he lost it all. 20 years since he last saw Isaiah and Elijah. And he still couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed them. Matthews? Greg turned his head slightly, startled by the voice. A man, maybe in his mid-20s, stood near his booth, staring at him with something between curiosity and hesitation. Greg studied him for a moment, tall, well-built, neatly dressed in a black turtleneck and tailored coat. His skin was a rich brown, his hair cropped short, but his eyes. Something about them was familiar. Too familiar. "Sorry, do I know you?" Greg asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. The young man exhaled sharply, running a hand over his chin as if bracing himself for something big. "You probably don't remember me," he said, stepping closer. "But I remember you." Greg straightened in his seat, suddenly on edge. "My name is Elijah." The young man's voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it. "Elijah Carter." Greg's breath caught in his throat. Elijah. One of the twins. Greg blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. It had been 2 decades. The last time he saw Elijah, he had been a helpless, starving infant cradled in his arms. Now, standing before him, was a man. A man with confidence, strength, and something else, something Greg hadn't expected. Gratitude. Greg swallowed hard. "Elijah. I." But before he could say another word, Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," he said, sliding it across the table. Greg hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he took it. The paper was thick, expensive. He opened it slowly. Inside was a neatly folded letter and, his breath hitched, an official-looking document with an embossed seal at the top. His eyes scanned the words. Then, he froze. It was a check. For $250,000. Greg looked up sharply. What is this?" Elijah smiled, a warmth in his eyes that nearly broke Greg completely. "It's what you deserve." Greg shook his head. I don't understand." Elijah slid into the booth across from him. "You saved my brother and me. You lost everything for us." He exhaled deeply. "And we never forgot." Greg felt his chest tighten. "Isaiah and I grew up knowing your name," Elijah continued. "Our adoptive mom told us everything. About how you risked your career for us. About how you made sure we got into a good home, even when you had nothing left." Greg's throat burned. I didn't do it for money." "We know," Elijah said, his voice soft. "That's why we're here." Greg looked at the check again, disbelief still clouding his mind. "I don't understand," he admitted. "Where did this come from?" Elijah chuckled. "Isaiah and I, we did okay for ourselves. We both went to college on scholarships. I became a lawyer. He's a tech entrepreneur." Greg felt his heart swell with something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. "We always said that if we ever made something of ourselves, we'd find you," Elijah said, leaning forward. "And we'd give you something back." Greg shook his head, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." Elijah smiled. "Say yes." Greg looked down at the check again. For years, he had lived in the shadows of his past, believing his sacrifice had been for nothing. But now he realized that it had meant everything. For the first time in 2 decades, Greg Matthews felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. And this was only the beginning. A debt beyond money. Greg stared at the check in his trembling hands. The numbers blurred as a mix of emotions surged through him, shock, gratitude, disbelief, and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He had spent the last 2 decades convincing himself that what he had done for those boys was nothing more than a forgotten footnote in a tragic story. He had lost everything, his job, his reputation, his sense of purpose, believing that his sacrifice had gone unnoticed. Yet here he was, sitting across from Elijah Carter, one of the twin boys he had saved all those years ago, now a grown man, looking at him with respect and admiration. It was almost too much to process. Greg swallowed hard, clearing the lump in his throat. "Elijah, this is incredible. But I can't take this." Elijah leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "I figured you'd say that." Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I didn't do what I did for money. I did it because it was right." Elijah's expression softened. "We know. And that's exactly why you deserve it. Greg set the check on the table, staring at it like it was a foreign object. He had been broke for so long that just the thought of this amount of money made his hands shake. But it wasn't about the money. It was about something more. I don't know what to say, Greg admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. Elijah leaned forward. Then don't say anything. Just hear me out. Greg glanced up, nodding. After you saved us, we got placed with an incredible woman, Elijah began, his voice full of warmth. Her name was Judith Carter. She had a heart bigger than the world. She raised us as if we were her own. Greg listened intently, soaking in every word. She always told us the truth about where we came from, about what happened that night. About you, Elijah continued. She told us that a man named Officer Matthews gave up everything just to make sure 2 abandoned babies got a chance at life. Greg swallowed hard, blinking against the burn in his eyes. Isaiah and I never forgot. We grew up wanting to make something of ourselves, not just for us, but for you. Because of what you did, we had a real shot. Greg exhaled sharply, overwhelmed by the weight of Elijah's words. Elijah smiled. So yeah, the check is just the first step. But this isn't about money, Greg. Greg flinched at the sound of his first name. He couldn't remember the last time someone had said it without resentment or pity. This is about repaying a debt, Elijah said firmly. Not because we have to. But because we want to. Greg studied him, searching for any sign of pity, any trace of obligation. But all he saw in Elijah's eyes was sincerity. You don't owe me anything, Greg finally said, his voice hoarse. Elijah chuckled. That's where you're wrong. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Elijah held up a hand. You didn't just save our lives that night. You gave us a future. And now, it's our turn to do the same for you. Greg sat back, overwhelmed. Elijah slid another envelope across the table. Greg hesitated before picking it up and opening it. His eyes widened as he pulled out a crisp set of documents. His breath caught when he realized what they were. Employment papers. A job offer. For the Carter Foundation? Greg asked, confused. Elijah nodded. It's a nonprofit, Isaiah, and I started a few years ago. We focus on helping at-risk kids, especially kids like us. Foster kids, abandoned kids, kids with no one looking out for them. Greg's throat tightened. We want you to be a part of it, Elijah continued. We need someone like you, someone who actually cares. Someone who understands what it means to put others first. Greg blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. Security, mentorship, casework, whatever you want to do, we'll make it happen, Elijah said. All we know is that we need you. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. For years, he had drifted through life, feeling like a man without a purpose. Now, for the first time in decades, he felt something stir inside him. A chance to do something that mattered. A chance to make a difference. A chance to belong again. He looked up at Elijah, his voice barely above a whisper. When do I start? Elijah grinned. How about right now? Greg let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was finally coming home. A purpose restored. Greg Matthews had spent the last 20 years believing his best days were behind him. But now, as he sat across from Elijah Carter in a quiet Chicago diner, staring at a job offer that promised something more than just a paycheck, he realized something. Maybe life wasn't done with him yet. The thought was almost too much to process. He had spent so long running from his past, from the weight of his mistakes, from the pain of losing his career and his sense of purpose. But here, staring him in the face, was an opportunity to build something new. A chance to be needed again. A chance to matter. He exhaled sharply, gripping the documents tighter. Elijah, I don't know what to say. Elijah smiled. Then don't say anything. Just take the job. Greg chuckled dryly, shaking his head. You don't even know if I'm qualified. Elijah leaned forward, his expression turning serious. You're more than qualified. You've been fighting for kids like us since before we even knew how to fight for ourselves. The only difference now is, you'll actually get paid for it. Greg hesitated, still trying to wrap his mind around everything. What exactly would I be doing? Elijah leaned back, crossing his arms. The Carter Foundation works with at-risk youth. Kids in foster care, kids in broken homes, kids one bad decision away from losing their future. We provide resources, mentorship, security, and sometimes, just a safe place to land. Greg listened, intrigued despite himself. We need someone who understands what these kids go through, Elijah continued. Someone who won't just see them as numbers on a file. Someone who'll fight for them the way you fought for us. Greg felt something stir deep in his chest. Security work is always an option, Elijah added. But I think you could do a lot more than just keeping watch. We've got kids who need guidance, who need someone to teach them discipline, self-respect, and how to stay out of trouble. Greg exhaled. And you think I'm that guy? Elijah smirked. I know you are. Greg let the words settle. He had spent so many years convinced that his career in law enforcement was the only thing that had given him value. But maybe his purpose had never been about the badge. Maybe it had always been about the people. After a long moment, he nodded. All right. I'll do it. Elijah's grin widened. Good. Because Isaiah and I already booked you a flight. Greg blinked. A flight? To where? Elijah's eyes twinkled. Home. A new beginning. Greg had almost forgotten what it felt like to be excited about something. The morning after his conversation with Elijah, he packed what little he had, some old clothes, a few personal belongings, and the one thing he had never been able to throw away, the news clipping from 20 years ago, the one that had called him a disgrace. He wasn't sure why he kept it. Maybe as a reminder of what he had lost. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it had just been a chapter in a much bigger story. By the time he boarded the flight, his hands were still shaking. He hadn't been back home in nearly a decade. The idea of returning, of stepping into a world that had moved on without him, was both terrifying and exhilarating. But when he stepped off the plane, any doubts he had were quickly erased. Isaiah was waiting for him. If Greg had thought Elijah was impressive, Isaiah was something else entirely. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, exuding confidence and quiet authority, the younger twin looked like a man who had spent his life mastering every room he walked into. But when he saw Greg, his entire face lit up. Officer Matthews, he said, stepping forward. Greg smirked. I think it's just Greg now. Isaiah shook his head, his grip firm as he clasped Greg's hand. Not to us. To us, you'll always be the man who saved our lives. Greg felt a lump rise in his throat but forced himself to push past it. So, he said, clearing his throat. Where do we start? Isaiah grinned. Follow me. The Carter Foundation. Greg had imagined a small office, maybe a few rundown buildings with struggling kids and overworked staff. What he didn't expect was an entire campus. The Carter Foundation was massive, an entire network of buildings, from a state-of-the-art community center to dorm-style housing for kids who had nowhere else to go. It was more than just a charity. It was a second-chance factory. Greg stared, overwhelmed. You built all this? Isaiah nodded. It took years. And a lot of work. But we got there. Greg shook his head in disbelief. This is incredible. Isaiah clapped him on the back. We had good motivation. As they walked through the campus, Greg saw kids of all ages, some playing basketball, others deep in conversation with mentors. Some looked wary, their eyes filled with the same guardedness he had seen in too many foster kids over the years. But there was something else too. Hope. Isaiah led Greg to an office overlooking the main courtyard. "This is yours," he said, handing him a key. Greg hesitated before taking it. "Mine?" Isaiah nodded. "You're one of us now. And we take care of our own." Greg exhaled sharply, gripping the key tightly. It had been a long time since anyone had called him family. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living again. And this was only the beginning that a legacy rebuilt. Greg Matthews sat in his new office at the Carter Foundation, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warm glow of dusk bathed the courtyard below, where kids played basketball, chatted in small groups, and walked with mentors who, just like Greg, had once needed a second chance. The past few days had been a whirlwind. His return to this city had been unexpected, but even more surprising was how natural it felt. As if he had been meant to be here all along. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door swung open, and Elijah stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, setting one in front of Greg before sinking into the chair across from him. Greg chuckled. "You Carter boys sure know how to take care of people." Elijah smirked. "You took care of us first." Greg sipped the coffee, savoring the warmth. "Still hard to believe all of this is real," he admitted. "Feels like yesterday I was just a washed-up ex-cop, wondering how I was gonna make it through the next week." Elijah leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found us that night?" Greg exhaled sharply. "More times than I can count." Elijah nodded. "Me too." For a long moment, they sat in silence, both lost in the weight of what had nearly been. Finally, Elijah spoke again. "I wanted to show you something." He pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the desk. Greg picked it up and flipped it open. His breath caught as he scanned the pages inside. It was a detailed report on a 15-year-old boy named Marcus Holloway. Greg's eyes narrowed. "Who is this?" Elijah leaned back. "A kid who reminds me way too much of myself at that age. Bounced around the foster system for years. Trouble at school. Few minor run-ins with the law." Greg studied the notes. "Sounds like he's on a bad path." "Not if we get to him first," Elijah said firmly. Greg nodded, flipping through the pages. He saw the patterns immediately: anger issues, trust problems, a tendency to push people away before they could hurt him. It was all too familiar. "Where is he now?" Greg asked. Elijah hesitated. "Juvenile detention. Got caught boosting a car. If he doesn't get help soon, he'll end up in the system for real." Greg felt a surge of determination. For the first time in years, he had the power to do something again. To change the trajectory of a life before it was too late. "What do you need me to do?" Greg asked. Elijah grinned. "I was hoping you'd ask that." A visit to the past. Greg stepped into the stark white visitor's room at the Juvenile Detention Center, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been years since he had set foot in a place like this. Across the table sat Marcus Holloway, a wiry kid with sharp eyes and a defiant expression. Greg had seen that look before. The look of a kid who expected the world to turn its back on him. Greg pulled out a chair and sat down. "Marcus, right?" The boy shrugged. "Who's asking?" Greg smirked. "Just a guy who used to be where you are now." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "You don't look like you've done time." "Not in here," Greg admitted. But I know what it's like to lose everything. To think you don't have a future. Marcus scoffed. Yeah? What happened to you? Greg leaned forward. I was a cop. A good one. Until I made a choice that cost me everything. That got Marcus's attention. He tilted his head. What kind of choice? Greg took a deep breath. The kind that saved 2 kids' lives but ruined my own. For the first time, Marcus hesitated. The defiance in his expression wavered just slightly. Greg saw his opening. You've got a choice to make, Marcus, he said. You can keep pushing people away, keep telling yourself that nobody cares, or you can let someone help you before it's too late. Marcus frowned, shifting in his seat. And who says you want to help me? Greg smiled. Because 20 years ago, someone helped 2 kids who didn't think they deserved it. And now, they run an entire foundation built to make sure kids like you don't get lost in the system. Marcus eyed him warily. And what do you get out of it? Greg's smile faded. A chance to do something that matters. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Fine. But I'm not making any promises. Greg smirked. Neither am I, kid. Let's just see where this goes. The first step toward redemption. 1 week later, Greg watched as Marcus hesitantly stepped onto the Carter Foundation campus. The kid looked around, eyes scanning the buildings, the basketball courts, the other kids laughing and talking. It was clear he didn't trust it. Didn't believe he belonged. Greg stepped beside him. Looks a little different than Juvie, huh? Marcus shrugged. I guess. Greg grinned. Give it time. As Marcus walked forward, Greg felt something shift deep inside him. For so long, he had believed that his story was over. That he had nothing left to give. But now, as he watched a troubled kid take his first steps toward a second chance, Greg Matthews finally understood something. His legacy wasn't in the badge he lost. It was in the lives he changed. And he was just getting started.